Hi, I'm Paul Stanenko. Welcome to this week's episode. Last week, we spoke with Dimitrius Kelly about 3D modeling and building libraries in DGlux. Next week, we're going to be talking about REST API and ways to get data into your application and parse it. However, today, this week, we're talking about actions, states, triggers, events, anything that has to do with making your application come alive for your clients. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and get behind the controls and see where it starts and where it goes from there. Okay, we're here in the controls, and let's explore actions and triggers. So first, let's jump into the data flow and take a look at the core element of any action. It's a state block. You can find it under in your block library here. You just search for state, and this is what it looks like. So let's take a look at it in more detail. It has two triggers, and we'll get into triggers after this. Obviously, enable, disable, duration, which controls how long does action take to execute, duration back, and two triggers, which basically two events that give you an event on finished and on reverted. Okay, so in its default state form, there's not much it can do. So for us to make it useful, we need to add a few properties. There's a plus button here in the corner, and we're going to go ahead and press it once. This adds a few more properties for us, and the key one is path. This is a path of the property that you're trying to affect. Right, so let's create a component. Just make it a simple square, and let's try to make the state block affect square's width. Right, so here I have my square selected, my square shape. This is the width, so I'm going to grab the blue dot and drag it to my path 0 of the state block. Right, notice that when I dropped it, it did not bind, it simply populated the path. Now this is a relative path, meaning this is a path from where the state block is to where the property I'm trying to affect is. Notice that nothing appeared here under change, because for it to read the property and create appropriate property renderer here, you need to click outside of the state block and then back inside. Right, now it generated a property of the same type as the property you're trying to affect. In this case, numeric. Okay, so change. What does a change do? Well, this is your target value. So currently it's 70. So let's say you want to set it to 100. Right, this is where you would specify the value. So what this means is that on invoke, the state block will change the property of width property of a shape to be a value of 100 with no animation. So it'll be a single jump. So let's go ahead and invoke. Right, and you notice what happened. It jumped the size from 70 to 100 pixels wide, and that's it. So let's bring back to 70, and this time let's add duration of 2 seconds and invoke again. Right, notice now instead of one single instantaneous jump, it interpolated the value from 70 to the target value, which is 100. And it did it over 2 seconds. Okay, well, that part I think is pretty simple, but let's dive a little bit deeper. What does a revert do? So if you haven't touched anything else here, so other than what we've already said, and simply press revert, it will set the value back to what it was before the invoke was executed. In this case, 70. And it's going to use the same duration to bring it back to 70. However, you do have more control over that. So if we press this I button to get more options, now we have quite a few properties to play with. Now this is our original target value, right? This is what gets set on invoke. The original is what gets set on revert. If it's null, and null, of course, in numeric shows up as auto, that means it will return to the value that was there prior to invoking the invoke. However, if you do specify a value, let's say 50, right? Then the revert will bring it to that value, to 50, not to the prior value, but to actually fixed value of 50. Right? So now it's going to toggle between 100 and 50. Okay, let's keep going. So you have easing effects, right? So this will create nice transitions and make animation feel a bit more natural. I'm not going to get too far into it. You can experiment with these. I'll just show you an obvious animation. So we're going to choose bounce. And let's reduce the animation size duration to half a second, right? And I'm going to revert and invoke, right? So you can clearly see the bouncing effect. And you can try others as well. Okay, easing back, again, by default, same as your original easing. But if you want different effect when reverting, you can set that as well. And strength, of course, refers to the strength of the easing, right? Now, now we get to one very important control property. It's called DisableSerialization. Now, what does that mean? By default, it's false, meaning that serialization is enabled. So it is not disabled, false. What this means is any change that this block makes to the page is serialized into the page code. And if you were to save the page, that new value gets saved with the page. However, if you disable it by setting the property to true, any changes that the block makes are not serialized into the code. And if you save the page and then reopen it, the value you will see in the target property is not what the state block set there, but what was there before that, right? Whatever you typed in manually or set some other way. So let me demonstrate this, because this I really want to drive this point home. This property will really make it easy for you to work on the page while not having to constantly reset the default properties back to what you want them to be before saving the page. Okay, so first, we're gonna keep it turned off, right? And we'll see how things are affected. So let's set the change to 200. Notice it's 100 now. So actually, I'm gonna type in 50. Right, so now 50 is serialized into the page. So if I'm gonna save the page, let's do save as. Just call it temp. I'm going to close and reopen the temp. Let's take a look at the box. It's 50, right? Obviously, anything I type into the property panel gets serialized as it should be. Now let's execute the block. Now let's save the page. Close and reopen. Right? Notice it's no longer 50, it's 200 now. So the state block ran, it set the value of 200 to our shape width, and that value was serialized. Okay, now let's set this back to 50. Right, disable serialization. Right, I'm going to save the page now. Right, so and reopen it. Right, it's 50. I'm going to again check that this is enabled, meaning serialization is turned off. Now I'm going to execute this, save the page, close, reopen. Notice this is not 200, this is back to 50. 50 is what was serialized in there originally because I typed it in, and my state block, while still setting this property, it does not serialize it. Again, so where is this extremely helpful? Now imagine a page that, for example, runs some actions on load, or maybe on some user interactions that change things, right? I mean, maybe they load some data, maybe they fetch some user values, whatever, they execute some actions. But when you work on the page, and obviously you test it and work on the page, you would have to go back and set all those values to defaults, right? And then save the page. This way, when the page opens, the values there are default values, and then something happens and they get set and so on. However, you can imagine that this can get pretty tedious, resetting the values manually to their default values after every page load. This is where disabling serialization really helps, right? So if you simply disable this, no matter what this block does, how it executes, and when it executes, its results are never saved with the page. So you never have to worry about returning the page to its default state before saving. It really cuts down on your development time significantly. I hope that was clear. Okay, so moving on, the last two properties we have, and by the way, you can add, of course, multiples to affect multiple properties, right? So using minus and plus, you can add remove items there to, of course, affect more than one property. They do execute virtually simultaneously. When I say virtually, is because obviously to human time perception, it's instantaneous. In reality, they may be a millisecond off or even, microsecond, whatever. So you shouldn't build any logic that strictly relies on them to happen ideally simultaneously. But for all intensive purposes, these fire off simultaneously. They don't necessarily go in order where, one is executed after previous one has completed. Okay, so in order to build such a staggered logic where something does not execute until something else has completed, you need to use multiple state blocks, and this is where unfinished event really comes into play. So for example, this block here will set my rectangle width to 200, right? If I want after that to be set to something else, right, I'm simply going to duplicate this block, in my case Control D, and I'm going to use this unfinished event. It's not pinned, so drag it to the invoke of the next block, right? And let me pin it so you can see this connection here, there. And this block, let's say I want to set it back to 50. So now if I execute the block, right, it gets set and then immediately set again to 50. Right, so this way you can create chain of events where each event is only executed after the prior one has completed. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about triggers. So triggers is what we need to launch a process, right? And so either a trigger or an event. Now, event, of course, is a read-only property. It happens, and it lets you know it happened. It gives you a value. Trigger is read-write, right? So you can affect the trigger. You can click it manually, or you can set it via some other means. So in this case, the block has two triggers, invoke and revert. So anything can be used to trigger it. And trigger will be triggered by any change of value other than null. What do I mean by that? So let's go ahead and keep this system in place so that it resets after every animation. And let's bring out a regular string and bind this to the invoke. Okay, it fired because the string has a empty value, but not null, right? This filled dot shows that it's not null, right? So if I start putting characters in there, on every change, it will fire off. However, if I reset it to null, notice nothing happened. It did not fire. Null will not fire a trigger. Other than that, any change of value will fire a trigger. So the trigger does not necessarily need an event bound to it, like this, right? Trigger can have regular property bound to it with regular values if you simply want to execute it on a change of value. So how do you handle null? What if you also want to execute it on null? So literally any change of value. Well, to do that, you have to add a little bit of logic that checks for null, right? So, and if it's null, again, the non-filled dot next to a property indicates null, right? Filled dot, but no value, simply means empty string, and it's a value. Anyway, so we're comparing null to null. So if null is null, then I'll give it any value. Let's do x. Otherwise, just pass along the original value. Okay, so this logic, notice what it does. So when the value is null, it sends x instead. When value is something else, right? So it works, but when value is null, it works as well, but it substitutes null with x. Now, of course, in here I'm assuming that my original value will never be x, because if it was, then there'll be no change and this will not fire. Now let me demonstrate that. So I'm going to give it some other value, right? Give it x, it fired, and then reset it to null, and nothing happened, right? Because null got replaced by x. There was already x there invoking the state prior to that, so no change was detected, so the state block did not fire. Right? So you just have to keep in mind that if you use a placeholder or some other value for null, try to make sure it's a value that you will not that would not come in the normal way, so that change still happens. Okie doke. So now let's move on to events. Right? Events are read-only single-time events, and they do expire, unlike a regular property with some value. So again, event would either have null or a value, and the value is always unique, meaning that every time event fires, it will generate a unique event value. So it will trigger a trigger if it's bound to 1 every time its event happens. However, if event does not repeat after a while, the value on its output will expire, meaning that after a certain time, I can't name the time right now, I think it's a minute or 2 minutes. If you bind the event to a trigger will not fire if that value is like a minute old. It's not a very commonly encountered scenario, so that's why I'm not, it's not at the top of my mind. Anyway, so what events do we have that we can use? Now, to create a normal page interaction, we typically deal with kind of user inputs, right? Click, hover, double click, and so on. Those you can find on any component in your outline. You can find them under actions. And if you just expand this little double arrow, right, these are all the events that the component can produce. And there are usually a few more events that are unique to the component that could be found under advanced. So let's explore this. So we have onClick event again, I have shape selected. So we're looking at events of the shape. So let's go ahead and use onClick and bind it to our state block. What does that do? Well, that makes it fire every time you click it. Mouse down is similar to click. However, click requires for you to click and let go to fire. Mouse down will fire as soon as you press the mouse down. It does not wait for you to let go. So right now I'm holding the mouse. Here I'll do it again. I'll click and hold, but it fired anyway. Mouse up, of course, is the other part of the click. This will fire when you let go of the mouse. And again, these have to happen over your component. If your mouse is elsewhere, these no longer are relevant, except for the events marked with global. So on mouse up global, when you let go anywhere, right, this event will fire. So let's go ahead and link it. Right. So, however, for it to fire, kind of important detail, almost missed, the mouse down would have had to happen on the shape. Right. So if I just click and let go anywhere else, nothing happens. When I click on the shape, then I can let go anywhere else, right? And it will fire. All right, and then so on. So we're not going to explore every single one. I think they're fairly self-explanatory. But you'll find that if you're trying to fire an event, basically in the way that most people are used to, which is when you let go of your either mouse or finger, especially for touch devices. So if there's a button on your touch device, when you put your finger on the button, you typically don't expect it to fire. It's when you let go is when you expect it to fire. And of course, if you do mouse up global, then it'll fire when you let go anywhere. However, users are typically expecting, like if they want to last minute change their mind and not press the button, but the finger is already down on the button, they would typically move their finger off the button and let go, hoping that it would not fire in that case. And for that to happen, you have to make sure you use on mouse up as your event. This will allow you to basically fire when you let go over the component. But if you click, drag out, and then let go, of course, then you basically don't fire the event. So you canceled your click, so to say. All right, so these are all events that will allow you to build both the touch screen and mouse interactions in a way that users are accustomed to. All right, and now that we know how state block works and how events and triggers work, let's get back to our project that we've started in the previous episode. And let's take another look at this expandable navigation menu. So now that we understand a bit more about how these components work, let's see what's happening there. Okay, so let's explore this. We have two state blocks, we have two if blocks, and we have a Boolean. Okay, so a Boolean controls the navigation menu, right? So it's not the click that makes it open or close, it's the Boolean, right? Now, why do we have two blocks and two if blocks? So when show nav is true, right, meaning the navigation is shown, right, I want to make sure that the next change fires off an event to collapse it, right, not to show it again. So let's look at the logic. So current show nav is true. Now if it's false, right, then we're going to pass x, which is a value that would have triggered this. However, when it's true, right, so down here, only when it's true would have pass x to trigger the expand. Now this may seem kind of the opposite, right, at first glance, right, because it's already expanded, right, and to collapse it, right, so it's not passing anything to collapse now. Well, that's because we have not invoked a change here, right? Now, as soon as we click it, right, that made this block active, right? Pass out x, x triggered the collapse, right? And the other way around, as soon as I toggle it, this condition became true, passed the x onto this state block and made it expand. Okay, so fine. So we have a mechanism that allows us to have a single variable that controls the state of our animated navigation menu. Now, what is controlling this variable, right? Why did I do it this way? So first, let's take a look at what's controlling it. So we have a button, little one up here, and here's the logic, right? So first of all, the state block references that very Boolean that we just saw, right? This is a path to that Boolean. What is it being changed to? Right? Because you can see it's not being changed to a hard-coded value. Instead, it's being changed to a result of another logical piece called not, which simply flips the Boolean. And again, our Boolean, right, that controls the menu is bound to this input. This block simply reverses it, so it outputs the opposite. So if it's true, it outputs the false, and that output is then used as a basically value for the state block. So every time you fire state block, it gets set to the opposite of what that Boolean is currently there, of value that it currently has. Right? And since this block is also changing the Boolean, what it does, it basically toggles it on and off. So you invoke it once, it gets set to true, right? Then the value gets reversed here, and the next value becomes false. When you trigger it, that false value gets set to the Boolean, right? The Boolean is bound in here, so it gets converted to true, so your next value becomes true. And on invoke, each time that next value gets set to the Boolean. So it toggles the Boolean on and off. Why did I do it this way? It's rather than having the button affect the state block to collapse or expand this directly, well, this allows me to control this navigation menu from multiple places, and I don't need to check what state it's currently in order to execute an action, right? For example, if I want the menu to collapse as soon as you select something from the menu, right? All I have to do is add extra action on click of the menu items to set the navigation to false, right? And it'll simply go away, right? And the button here wouldn't need to know that the state has changed, so the next action should now be expand rather than collapse. Okay, so we're done with this section. Let's take a look at one more method that is very useful and will come in handy, I guarantee it. And that method has to do with passing a value to a component. There are two ways to do it as we know it. One would be the binding, but the other one is setting it via a state block. And why would you want to do that instead of a binding? Well, let's say you have a component that needs to display a value that came in from several sources, right, at the same time, right? So there are also ways to set it up with a binding, with a hub block, but there are other conditions that sometimes force this kind of behavior. So, for example, you need to set something in project data flow. You cannot bind to project data flow. So the only option you have is to use a state block. So if you have a value that's constantly changing, let's see if we have any. Okay, there we go. We have kind of airflow varying a bit. That's good. And supply air temperature. Okay, so let's bring out a gauge. Switch to design mode. And here, let's use this one actually. So, and let's say we need this gauge to reflect that particular value. Bring it out. And we can simply bind it, right? So where's our value? There's the value. Right, and there we go. Now it's rounding, so that's fine. Now, what if we could not have this binding, right? What if we had this sort of scenario? So in the project data flow, we had a variable called SAT, supply air temperature, and that what's always driving the gauge. And depending on what else is open, we want to control this variable so that our gauge reflects it. Right, so I'm going to bring it up here for our binding. Right, so now I can't bind to it. Right? It doesn't let me because it's in the project data flow and nothing can be bound to project data flow. Right? So what can I do? Well, what I can do is have a state block, right, that sets it. Now notice that every time my target is in the project data flow, my path will start with @lib, and this is not a relative path. This is an absolute path. It does not matter where the state block resides. This path will always be valid. It would always point to project data flow, block called SAT, and property called value, right? And our target would be set. Okay, well that's simple enough. But how do we execute it, right? So we don't really have an event to execute it. We just want to pass whatever value is there to always keep passing it, right? So we can do this. This will literally use the value itself to trigger an invoke. So every time the value changes, gets executed. This, however, does not capture null. So if the value is null, the gauge will remain at last known value, right? If that's not what we want, then we need to add a condition that we've already discussed. So we're going to use this change, check it against null. If it is, we'll use 0. If it's not, we'll use the original value, and that will execute our state block, right? So now, any change of this will execute and force a change. Oh, there it is. So you can see it started climbing, and it's automatically passing the value to the gauge. And it's climbing up because we have logic there in the server-side data flow that brings it up, brings the supply temp to the set point. So set point is 78, so it's going to try to bring it to 78. And so now we're controlling the gauge without actually being bound to anything, right? So this way you can set central, your global public variables from various places without depending on binding. All right, and a quick side note for you hawk-eyed viewers out there who have noticed a data flow on the server called COVID. Well, I was going to get to it a bit later, but let me share it real quick of what it is. I've been building a little dashboard to, let me go ahead and open this, to track COVID coronavirus spread using public API, and we're gonna cover this when we get to API calls, basically making calls for data for your application. But this is what it looks like. It's going to take a second for the data to get populated, and there we go. Okay, so and I made it for California, or at least the lower chart where you can actually look it up by county. There it is, just a quick teaser. We will be looking at this when we cover API and REST calls. Until then, back to the studio. And we're done. Well, so that's it for today's episode. Don't forget, next week we're talking about API and data, so make sure to be here. Otherwise, like, subscribe. I'm Paul Stanenko. Go build something.